Welcome to another Book Expo. I am Steve Rosado, Event Director for Book Expo America. Thank you all for coming out. We'll be starting with the Editor's Buzz panel in just a moment. But first, we'd like to take this point in time, and BEA likes to honor someone from the industry. We have the BEA Industry Ambassador Award, which honors a publishing industry professional who has distinguished themselves by representing, promoting, and the interests of publishing as a whole. Those are the characteristics that define BEA's mission as a platform, advancing the interests of BEA's various stakeholders, making BEA the great event it is, and serving the entire trade publishing industry for greater good. This year's honoree is a person who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a very long time. Picking just a few words that describe this individual will include entrepreneurial, visionary, bold, brilliant, and passionate. And I would just be getting started. This individual launched her company in 1987 by self-publishing a resource book for the banking industry. She has relentlessly applied her vision in creating new possibilities for readers and authors. She broke new ground in 1998 by launching a multimedia imprint that produced books and CDs, and since then has been on a path of growth that's included acquisitions like Cumberland House and successfully launching a children's and poetry imprints. Source Books has created more than 30 New York Times and USA Today best-selling titles, dozens of national bestsellers, and numerous category bestsellers. In 2011, it was publishing more than 300 books and calendars in a year. Source Books is also noted as the largest woman-owned trade publishing company in the United States. I am incredibly honored to name Dominique Roca as the 2013 BEA Industry Ambassador Award winner.
Totally overwhelmed. And obviously I'd like to thank you, but more I'd like to say to you, we are so lucky to be part of this industry. This is the most important thing that I can think of to do, to pass the future in books, right? And I thank each and every one of you and the work that you do to really bring that future forward. I've been incredibly blessed to work with you, and I hope I get to continue to do that in the future. Thank you so very much to all of our booksellers, our authors, and our friends, the many friends we have, and of course my team. It's been an extraordinary journey. It's been the journey of a lifetime, and I thank you for it. Bye-bye.
Okay, I'll now introduce Betsy Burton to get going on the Editor's Buzz. Thank you very much, everyone.
Why is it that the act of book selling doesn't feel at all like selling? Why does it feel like we're passing on the Holy Grail every time we put the right book into the right hands? The answer, of course, is that books have the capacity to change lives, much as religion does for those who have faith. And I have faith in books. So do all the rest of us in this industry. We may be a polyandrous lot, our passions easily roused by the next book, but that's because our faith lies in books rather than in one book. Our creed rests on the right to read widely and freely, rather than narrowly and carefully. And books are both an ongoing and a varied source of inspiration to us, whether in terms of ideas, perception, angle of perception, feelings, stories that draw us either into or out of our common humanity, or language that takes us to new places as surely as Gregorian chants once did monks. But our faith lies in something else as well as in books. It lies in our trust for one another. The trust an editor has in a particular agent that makes that editor eager to pick up a particular manuscript. The trust sales reps have in certain editors that impel those reps to pick up this galley instead of that one. The trust we booksellers have in reps, and believe me, we do. And in the editors themselves. It's this line of trust based on our faith and knowledge of the kindred passion of the people we deal with that takes books from the hands of authors and ultimately does place them in the hands of readers. It's an odd process, and there's no way to mechanize it because it's based on faith, and for the most part, on face-to-face conversation. There was a new study of Codex that said that discovery takes place 81% of the time in face-to-face conversation. It's actually a grassroots kind of process, since in essence, buzz is a perfect loop that begins with an editor's faith in a book, then transmits that faith through reps to the cornfields and urban jungles of independent bookselling. There we leap our way through the galleys given to us by reps or by Indie Bound, looking for this editor's name, that fellow bookseller's endorsement. We begin to buzz and chirp about the books that transfix us. We're like clouds, entire orchestras of noisy crickets. All these chirps and buzzes do sell books, but more importantly, perhaps, they're overheard by media as we buzz not just in our stores, but in all of our communities, all over the country, in paper, on radio, on TV, in all the cities and hinterlands, until suddenly the world is abuzz over a book. That buzz starts with a single instant, the moment when an editor reads a passage in a manuscript and the hair on her arms stands up and she whispers in wonder or in awe or with burning curiosity or in horror, as the 6 editors here today have all done many times before, and yet again over the 6 books they've brought us. Taken together, these 6 books showcase the enormous variety that makes this industry so incredible. Some shocking us, some devastating us, all pulling us into new and morally complex worlds. Taken separately, each one of these amazing books will, I promise you, create buzz in the cornfields and urban jungles of independent bookselling. Thank you. When I said devastating, I was speaking of more than one of the books here today, but in particular of Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt's Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields by Wendy Lauer, edited by Deanne Urmy. Midway through Hitler's Furies, Lauer says, quote, "The large number of female criminals who stole from the Jews, who administered the genocide, who participated in the crime scenes, are missing from our collective memory and official histories. Well, thanks to Lauer's prodigious research and hard-hitting prose, they no longer are. Terry Tempest Williams has said that by bearing witness, the story that is told can provide a healing ground, and that if we choose to turn our backs, we've walked away from what it means to be human. Wendy Lauer didn't turn her back, nor did her courageous editor. Senior Executive Editor Deanne Urmy has worked at Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt since 2002. Her list features award-winning books on current affairs, social sciences, and history. Some of her writers include New York Times bestselling author Paul Tough, How Children Succeed, New York Times columnist Charles Blow, and National Award winner James Carroll. Urmy edits biographies with rich cultural context, including Megan Marshall's The Peabody Sisters, winner of the Parkman Prize, and Robert Richardson's William James, winner of the Bancroft Prize. She also edits the best-selling graphic memoirist Alison Bechdel and Michael Patrick McDonald. A graduate of Bowdoin College, Urmy moved to Boston for her first publishing job, answering the telephone at David R. Godine, where she acquired her first book from the front desk. That's right out of the movies. Please welcome Deanne Urmy.
Thank you, Betsy, and thank you, fellow comrades on the panel, and Wendy Lauer. Is this all right? Is this better? Thank you. I'll say it again then because it's important. Thank you, Betsy. And thank you, fellow comrades on the panel, and our extraordinary author, Wendy Lauer. I see her surrounded by my loyal colleagues at Houghton Mifflin, just the way they always surround me. Thank you. So on the screen, yes, meet Liese Rydell. She was the daughter of an ironworks foreman in Western Germany, and with a 9th grade education, she got a job first on a chicken farm and then working as a cook. But she wasn't earning enough in these jobs, so she applied for a job sponsored by the Nazi Party at a local newspaper. And it was there she met her soon-to-be husband, a guy named Gustav Wilhaus. He was a sales manager for newspapers and also a Nazi stormtrooper and an SS member. So the photograph you see was actually taken as part of Liesel's marriage application, which required and soon received the official okay from the SS under Heinrich Himmler. So in March 1942, Liesel, still a very young woman, learned that Gustav was being sent east to the Ukraine to supervise Jewish workers, prisoners working in armaments factories. But she couldn't have imagined what she herself would witness there in the East, and certainly she couldn't have imagined what she would do there with her own hands. So Hitler's Furies delivers a stunning account of the role of German women on the Nazi killing fields of the Eastern Front. Our author, Wendy Lauer, opens our eyes for the first time to the fact that huge numbers of young German women went east, nurses, teachers, office workers, secretaries. They went to the territories of Poland and Ukraine, Baltics, Belarus. There were hundreds of thousands, at least 500,000 women in direct contact with the Nazi atrocities in the East. And she builds the case that these women built their professional and personal lives literally in the killing fields, that there was absolutely no geographic separation. They went on shopping sprees and on dates with German officers in the ghettos. And in another instance, when a group of secretaries picnicked in the woods near Riga in the east, they smelled the stench of mass graves, and they picked a new spot. The statement, "I didn't know," just doesn't apply to these women in the East. And most dramatically, Hitler's Furies brings to light stories of female brutality and murder as chilling as any we've had in history. Stories like that of Erna Petri, a young SS wife, the mother of a small child, who found 6 nearly naked Jewish children on the newly acquired Polish estate she and her husband were given as they were colonizers. They were given this estate. And she took the Jewish children home to feed them, and then she shot them, as she'd seen done so many times, one by one, in the back of the neck. These stories, you'll be completely convinced of this, are the tip of the iceberg. There were thousands of women who actually killed. So this shifts us away from the narrow focus on female concentration camp guards that have been at the center of our understanding, completely at the center of our understanding, really, of German women killers. It's an explosive case, and this is that ordinary German women, given the opportunity, became killers for the Reich. And we found out just how explosive when we sold foreign rights to a dozen countries based on the proposal alone, just within a few weeks of acquiring the book. And so there are 13 women profiled in Hitler's Furies. We follow these characters from the time they first enter their profession and then are assigned to wartime duty in the East. And each one ends up playing an indelible role in one of the 3 central chapters of the book, which are witnesses, accomplices, killers. And there's dramatic tension, believe me, in meeting each of these young women, and as you go along, not knowing which of these chapters she's going to end up in. So Wendy lays first powerful, original groundwork for what these very young women became and did in the East. These were the World War I baby boomers. They came of age during the intense tumult of the Weimar Republic, and then the dramatic turn to the right, of course, and the rise of the Nazis. These women experienced their political awakening right alongside the rise of a genocidal regime, and that, Wendy shows us, was the first perversion. But this was also a time of big opportunity. These women could leave their villages for the first time. They could make something of their lives. That was a new concept. They were excited about that. So these ambitious, non-elite young women were also able to enter certain professions like nursing for the first time. But with the rise of Nazism, these caring professions, nursing, teaching, were molding women in awful new ways. That would be the second perversion. Ordinary German girls and women were often betrayed by nursing in routine exams, and the nurses would recommend abortions and sterilizations but for supposedly genetic conditions, maybe depression. Women teachers, including of the very youngest children, were encouraged to report disabilities like epilepsy, but also like a child not being able to button her coat. So, in other words, women were really systematically mobilized to betray other women. And alongside the ethic of being tough enough to betray the vulnerable, they were all taught, almost every woman of this generation were taught martial stuff, like, they needed to do, they were drilled in marching and sharpshooting. So all this turned out to be perfect training for what this really morally lost generation of young women would witness and do in the East. We've seen this period in history. We know interwar history. We know the rise of the Nazis, of course, but we've really never seen it through the lens of these young women. We've never understood how the rise of Nazism formed the development, or actually deformed the development, of this whole generation of women. So if this interwar period was this generation's formative time, the East was its formative place. Hitler himself was just fanatically focused on restoring these huge territories lost under the World War I Treaty of Versailles. In his imagination, and so in the Nazi imagination, the East was a frontier where anything was possible, literally a wild East. These young women that we've met in this book by this time, we see them, they're eager for bigger lives. They want better jobs. They want husbands, hopefully, but, with luck, a husband in the SS, because that would be their ticket to a place in the new racially defined elite that had grown up. These women all saw the Wild East as their generation's place of limitless opportunity, and they flocked there. So how did Wendy Lauer, our extraordinary author Wendy Lauer, uncover the story of what women did in the East? It's a story, after all, that's been hidden for 70 years. Wendy was a young PhD student already interested in German history and Holocaust history when the former Soviet Union fell, and she traveled right away in 1992 to Ukraine to look at countless pages of official German documents and files of photos, newspapers, newsreels, these things had all been abandoned hastily during the German retreat when the Soviets swept in and really kept as war booty by the Soviets behind the Iron Curtain for decades. And she noticed first that these documents contained evidence of women in the East, something that maybe surprised her a little bit. This presence had basically been suppressed, after all, and denied since the war. And then she realized, importantly, that hundreds of these German women had been called to testify as witnesses during Soviet and East German war trials, war crime trials. So she asked herself, she read the transcripts, many of them, and asked herself, how could these women testify with such intimate knowledge of these brutal crimes? How could that be? And also, why did they sound in so many cases so callous and so defiant? Her realization was that these women had nothing to fear. The prosecutors were interested only in male crimes and only in the male perpetrators. So these women's acts were hiding in plain sight. And that set her off. She began to search for the women themselves, speaking with the prosecutors, visiting the crime scenes, scouring Nazi party records, street maps, telephone books. She's fluent in German, and she interviewed a number of the women extensively with many rich interviews. So many of the stories she uncovered, that Wendy uncovered, are obviously very dark. But what keeps you in pursuit of this story as a reader is, are just these original, rigorous, brave questions that you sense Wendy asking all along the way about this history for 20 years. And I want to give Wendy the last word. She says, genocide is women's business as well as men's. When given the opportunity, women too will engage in it, even the bloodiest aspects. Minimizing women's culpability to a few thousand brainwashed and misguided camp guards does not accurately represent the reality of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Life seemed impossible to understand and mad beyond belief in Hitler's Furies. In a very different way, the same is true for Eric Lundgren's The Facades, published by Overlook and edited by Liese. The Facades isn't a mystery novel per se, rather, all of life is a mystery in this subversive and dazzling debut novel. The Facades is set in a Midwestern city that now values its fairgrounds and facades, its history of failure, a place where shades of Kafka and Camus haunt the dying malls and decrepit manors and the minds of the inhabitants. I recently overheard a comment from an academic delivered in a condescending voice proclaiming, editors play it safe. They always search for sameness, never for the offbeat or the risky. Having just read in quick succession Hitler's Furies and The Facades, I took great pleasure in disagreeing publicly with her. And here to prove my point is the amazing Liese, who was educated at Bard College, worked at Little Brown Grove Atlantic in Grupo Santillana in Argentina, and joined the Overlook Press in 2012 as associate editor and manager of contracts and subsidiary rights. She's drawn to character-driven nonfiction with strong narrative elements, to history with cultural and social overtones, and to memoir, investigative journalism, biography, travel, and pop culture. We can now add cutting-edge fiction to this list of preferences. Perhaps the most amazing thing about her from my aged perspective is her age, which gives me great faith in the future of books. Please welcome Liese.
Thank you so much. It is such a great honor to speak with all of you about The Facades, and it's especially exciting because it's the first book that Overlook's ever had on the Buzz panel before. Overlook was founded in 1971 by my father and my grandfather, and when I joined this past summer, I did so with the great excitement that there was a kind of novel that I really wanted to read that wasn't available on Overlook's list. And shortly after that, I went to a dinner party, and I sat next to a friend of mine who is a novelist, and the conversation quickly turned to books. And as we started talking about the books that move us and the books that excite us, and as I started telling him about what I hoped to acquire at Overlook, he told me that he had a great friend, a guy named Eric Lundgren, who he had gone to an MFA program with and who had really been the star of his program. And when he graduated, he found an agent, and the book was submitted widely. And many editors came very close to buying it, but couldn't get it passed for one reason or another. And he put it in his drawer, and he became a librarian at St. Louis Public Library, where he works now, and I think started working on something else. And this friend asked if I wanted to take a look at it, and I said, of course I did. And I started reading it the next day, and I was instantly blown away by it. I knew within the first few pages that I desperately, desperately wanted Overlook to publish this book in that sort of great way that fiction can make worlds seem like they're opening up, and sort of good books create a hunger for other great books. And suddenly this imaginary pile of books next to your bed grows from sort of 5 to 15. And I shared it with my father, and he loved it, and we shared it with another editor at Overlook, Dan Chrisman, and he loved it. And then shortly after, when we acquired it, and then a few weeks later, my father hired another editor at Overlook named Mark Krotov, and when he started, he said, there is a book that I read 4 years ago on submission that I have never been able to forget. And the first book that I want to buy, I want to try to find this author, and I hope that we can buy it. And my father said, we've already bought it. And then another thing, if anybody here is a Calvino fan, the city in the book is based on one of Calvino's Invisible Cities, which is a brave undertaking in and of itself. And so when we were looking for jacket art, I started Googling Invisible Cities, Trude Calvino. And I found this young German artist who had illustrated all of Calvino's Invisible Cities. And the cover of the book is his illustration of Trude. And it just felt so crazily serendipitous because it fits the tone of what is inside so beautifully. And so all of this sort of really organic energy started building behind it, and then we found out that it had been selected for the Buzz panel. And it is, of course, the language and the feeling in Eric's utterly distinct voice that has seduced readers, but the plot itself grabs you right from the beginning. We're in the imaginary city of Trude, and on the night of a sold-out performance, the city's most celebrated opera singer vanishes. When police fail to provide answers, her husband, Sven Norberg, takes to the streets searching for any trace of her. But in the very first few pages, we can already see that this isn't going to be an ordinary detective story. Trude is a labyrinthine, bizarre city that is somewhere between Kafka's Prague and Batman's Gotham City. And as Norberg starts to journey through the streets, it becomes very hard to sort of know where Norberg ends and the city begins. And as he travels into the crumbling landscape, he also starts to descend into his own troubled memory. And we see him come to realize that, how passive a husband he had been for years, and not even just that, sort of what a backseat role he had taken in his life. He's sort of stumbled through his life as if he's just sort of reading some book. And now that he is on the brink of losing everything, his wife, his son, his job, he really needs to become an active character in his own story. And Trude provides an uncannily perfect theater for this kind of soul-searching as the architecture starts to become a manifestation of his emotional state. There are really two kinds of detective stories at work. As Norberg searches through this broken city for any trace of his wife, we as the reader have to start searching his voice for the truth about him. And at its heart, The Facades is really a book about self-deception and self-discovery. And it's a book about the stories, the evolution of the stories that we tell ourselves, and that feels like a really canned publishing line that and the books that sort of show us how to see our lives in slightly altered ways. And in some books, the strangeness is its own end, but the strangeness of The Facades offers something very revelatory and very profound. Sort of like Gregor Samsa in Kafka's Metamorphosis, Eric's Trude is a fantastical lens through which we start to see our own reality more sharply. Trude is a dream version of an American city. You read it and you put it down, and somehow the way you relate to your city or your town has changed. Somehow the streets that you walk every day to work, to your house, to meet your friends, somehow your loves and your losses and your hopes and your dreams have sort of all become fossilized in the streets around you. Eric has a sensibility and a command of the uncanny that calls to mind Auster's New York trilogy and Murakami's The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle and Tom McCarthy's Remainder without ever sounding derivative. I have read it 7 times at least now, and every time I do, it absolutely breaks my heart. Eric is the real deal. When I made my offer on this book, I instantly called the agent back and asked if I could offer on his second novel without having read a word of it, because I don't have any doubts that he will be a name who will come to mean something to lots of people. We got the great news 2 weeks ago that The Facades had been chosen as a Barnes & Noble Discover book, and we are so thrilled about that. But we've always really been convinced that this is a book that the independent booksellers and the librarians could really embrace and champion. I hope you will all come meet Eric tomorrow at 10 when he speaks on the Buzz panel, and then come meet him at the booth at 2 o'clock for his signing, because he is fantastic. Thank you.
If The Facades was surreal and fantastical, The Affairs of Others, written by Amy Grace Loyd, published by Picador, a division of Macmillan, and edited by Anna deVries, is perhaps its polar opposite. As lyrically written as The Facades, The Affairs of Others is grounded in painful reality. Its scorching scenes of sexual violence shock the reader, so too do Loyd's troubling insights into human character, as we witness a grief-swamped widow gradually coming to life, while upstairs from her, she can hear an abandoned wife and mother's attempts to drown grief by plunging into extreme and dangerous sexual behavior. Emotionally harrowing, The Affairs of Others makes clear to the reader that from the outside one can never know why others do what they do. Now, to lend further clarity to this remarkable novel, please welcome Anna deVries. Before beginning a distinguished career as an editor, Ms. deVries was a fellow bookseller who worked at one of my all-time favorite bookstores, the late great Dutton's in North Hollywood, and later at the amazing Seminary Co-op bookstore in Chicago. Having left our side of the industry, deVries has spent 10 years in publishing, 7 in the editorial department at Scribner. She has acquired and published Alice Always by Harriet Lane, named an Editor's Choice title by the New York Times Book Review, 1222 by Ann Holt, nominated for the Edgar Award for Best Mystery Novel, and Bad Traffic by Simon Lewis, nominated for an LA Times Book Prize. She has worked with such authors as Ursula K. Le Guin, George P. Schultz, and Denise Hamilton. A graduate of the University of Chicago, she's a native New Yorker. Please welcome Picador Senior Editor Anna deVries.
Thank you. Thank you, Betsy. I'm thrilled to be here in a room full of old colleagues and friends and people who love books, because I love this book, The Affairs of Others, and it is set in my hometown, New York. Now, New York City has a way of turning strangers into family. Living tightly packed together, as many of us do, in tiny apartments with thin walls, you end up learning a lot more about your neighbors than you would like. In my own small apartment building, my neighbors and I keep an eye out for each other, feed each other's cats when vacations take us away from home, indulge in collective complaining when the bar down the street is too loud or the hot water doesn't work. And we are also privy to a lot of the things we wish we didn't know about each other. The loving, the fighting, the dating, the breakups. New York is a city full of stories, and many of them don't make it beyond the apartment door. It is in this world that we find Celia Casil, the main character in Amy Grace Lloyd's enthralling debut, The Affairs of Others. Celia is determined to live a private life, one that is mostly bound by the reach of the small apartment building she owns in downtown Brooklyn, and by her memories of the past. 5 years earlier, her husband died too young, and as she says, I went with him, or a lot of me did. She refuses to engage in the recovery act that is so often demanded from sufferers of loss. She will not move on. She holds on to her grief and ignores the demands made on a young woman in an ambitious city like New York. Instead, she pulls back into a space that exists outside modern life. She has no computer, no smartphone, no iPod. Instead, she wanders the streets of New York, watches old Hollywood movies, or tends to the other tenants in her building. Celia is a careful curator of these tenants, choosing them for their ability to respect her privacy and their own. The novel opens with the arrival of a subletter, an older woman aptly named Hope, who provokes Celia to comment, it would be fair to say she was beautiful. Hope's husband has just left her after 25 years of marriage, and she is looking for a place to hide out for a while. Very soon, Hope begins an affair with an old boyfriend in the apartment right above Celia's. As Celia listens to the nightly performance between Hope and her boyfriend, she is drawn into the drama of her neighbor's life, to the point where she begins to violate the privacy of those she once respected. Things begin to change in the building. The tenant on the top floor, a retired ferry captain, disappears, and the couple in the second floor apartment begin to experience their own difficulties. A building that was once quiet and sedate now becomes a charged stage for the chaos of modern life. When I received The Affairs of Others on submission, my seat was barely warm in the Picador office. I had started working there only a few weeks before. It came in late in the week, and by Monday morning I was in my publisher's office, brimming with enthusiasm, reading lines aloud, and spouting ideas for publication, along with my publisher and publicity director, who had read alongside me. It was an early moment of kismet I shared with my new colleagues, and within 24 hours I had acquired the novel. Some of you may already know Amy Grace Lloyd, but in her role as a skilled and talented editor of fiction. She's worked for The New Yorker and New York Review Books. She was a fiction editor for Playboy for many years, and she's currently editing a stellar list of writers at Byliner. I have to admit it was slightly intimidating working with such an experienced and well-respected editor. In fact, it's the first time I ever received a critique of my own editorial letter from one of my own writers. Amy was kind and thoughtful, as always. It is a testament to Amy's acumen as an editor and a writer that many of the authors she has worked with and put through rigorous editorial campaigns have now lined up to praise her first novel. Jess Walter and Richard Russo's words are generous, but they are also true. The Affairs of Others is not only beautifully written and psychologically astute, it is a taut and breathless read, and it keeps you engaged until the very end. The intelligence and the heartbreak of the writing held me from the first page, as did the force of Celia's voice. There has been some discussion lately of the likability of female characters, particularly those who are angry because their lives don't pan out as they hope. I won't restart that conversation here, but I will say that one of the pleasures of reading is to inhabit a life and a voice that is not one's own. And here, Amy Grace Loyd has so perfectly captured Celia's voice, a woman whose life has not taken the path she expected. I hope you'll understand her, perhaps even like her, as she rages against fate and is unapologetic as she bucks the expectations society places upon her. Women say sorry too often, Celia comments. We say it when it's not ours to say. Leaning in doesn't just happen in the boardroom, you know. One of the strongest elements of The Affairs of Others and what initially struck me about this novel was the powerful way in which Amy has articulated the intensity and intimacy of grief. She can still feel the touch of her husband and the weight of her body against hers. Celia is tough, she endures, but she also stubbornly holds on to the ghost of her husband. She keeps a copy of the last book she read to him sealed up in a plastic bag, the better to lock in the smell of the soup she was cooking as she last read to him. This is as much a physical novel of blood and sweat and lips and flesh as it is about ghosts and desire and loss. This is also a sexy book. There's quite a bit of sex in these pages. And there is also a pleasure to the sentences, to the interaction between the characters, the food eaten, the wine drunk, themes of indulgence and sensuality throughout that provide a lushness and fullness that is in contrast with Celia's initial ascetic life. Ultimately, what I found so deeply satisfying about this novel is that while we struggle and grieve with Celia initially, there is that cathartic renewal at the end, as life's joys are rediscovered, relationships with the world renewed, and love affairs engaged in. The novel opens with the party and ends with the party, and in the pages between, we have watched Celia transform into a woman fully engaged with her world, looking outward. To give you a sense of the wonderful voice of this novel, I want to read to you from the opening passage from the book. The body of a woman aging. It's a landscape that, even as it vanishes, asks a lot of the eyes, or it should. No two landscapes the same. They never were the same, no matter their age. But then how time brings details to the body. Of course, every woman's body ages. What's disorienting is how friendly it all starts out, with words like smooth and tight and firm, high and pink and wet. Words that are given to women's bodies and that they wear around as comfortably as cotton. And why not? These are gifts they did little to earn. Life does this so rarely, offer unearned or unasked for rewards. But inevitably, the words fall away one by one. There goes tight. There goes smooth. God, even wet. And the words that replace them, that are provisioned, are not nearly so welcome or easy to carry. Some women carry these new ways of addressing their bodies with pride. They'll explain that the knots in their flesh tell a good story. Others celebrate the change of vernacular, the end of a certain kind of surveillance. Or they continue to pursue the first set of words, high, tight, smooth. It's not wrong, or it's not for me to say. Who am I to say? Thank you.
Sheri Fink's 5 Days at Memorial, Life and Death in a Storm-Ravaged Hospital also looks at brutal reality, this time in a New Orleans hospital during Hurricane Katrina and its horrific aftermath. In this nonfiction work, edited by Venessa Mobley and published by Crown, a division of Random House, Fink looks at what occurred during those horrific days before and after the levees broke, the terror that flooded the hospital halls, the heat, the darkness, the rising levels of water, and at the life and death decisions made in haste by the exhausted medical personnel, sometimes with shattering consequences. Here to give a far more complex and complete picture of this heartrending and morally complex tale is Crown's executive editor extraordinaire, Venessa Mobley. Her list of authors reads like a who's who of the book industry. During her distinguished career, she's edited 3 first books that won the Pulitzer: A Problem from Hell by Samantha Power, Imperial Reckoning by Caroline Elkins, and The Lords of Finance by Liaquat Ahmed. She's also edited first books by Clay Shirky, Here Comes Everybody, Matthew Crawford, Shop Class of Soulcraft, and Chris Hayes, Twilight of the Elites. Her list at Crown includes biography, politics, social issues, ancient Egyptian archaeology, autism, and 20th century fashion. Her current authors include, among others, Rebecca Skloot, Frances Mays, Jonathan Kozel, New Yorker writer Rebecca Mead, and New York Review of Books contributor, Yasmin El-Rashidi, which is, you can see what I mean about who's who. A graduate of Williams College, Ms. Mobley now lives in Manhattan. Please welcome Venessa Mobley.
Thank you. So there's a kind of nonfiction book. Can you hear me? Sorry. There's a kind of nonfiction book on the table. It's not on? Do you want to pass right in your Okay. Can you hear me now? There's a kind of nonfiction book that reconstructs for its reader a whole world, painstaking detail by painstaking detail. And when you read it, you're invited to inhabit this world and a place and a time. I'm describing the kinds of books that critics, when you're a lucky editor, call masterful, or book editors have a habit of saying the manuscript kept them up all night. I'm sure each of us have a book like this or 2 on our shelves. For me, Francis Fitzgerald's Fire in the Lake is one, or Lawrence Wright's The Looming Tower is another. As an editor, I'm not sure I ever thought I would edit one of these books or be its first reader, but here I am to tell you about Sheri Fink's 5 Days at Memorial, Life and Death in a Storm-Ravaged Hospital. Sheri Fink is an award-winning journalist and physician. The reporting that formed the backbone of this book has already been honored with a National Magazine Award and a Pulitzer Prize. Her credentials as a journalist are impeccable and impressive, but without them, this book, which is the result of 6 years of reporting and over 500 interviews, could not have been written. But this is much more than a remarkable assemblage of facts. It is also a masterful feat of storytelling that almost never was. The events that Sheri Fink recounts in this book were ones that many would have preferred never saw the light of day. 5 Days is at its heart the unraveling of a mystery. Why did a single hospital in New Orleans, flooded in the wake of Katrina like so many other buildings in New Orleans, unevacuated like every other hospital in New Orleans, see the deaths of 45 patients, many of them at or around the same day? At whose hands did these people die? And who is to blame? In pursuit of these questions, Sheri Fink has constructed an ingenious book, the first half of which brings us deep inside a hospital robbed of every facet of 20th century or 21st century convenience, electricity for one. As temperatures inside the hospital started to rise, the night sky carried the sounds of gunfire, and AM radio broadcast unfounded rumors of martial law. Memorial came to resemble an island of civilization in a sea of chaos. But we know that civilization has a way of breaking down. Memorial Medical Center was packed to the rafters with people. There were 200 patients there, 600 doctors, nurses, and caregivers, as well as their family members and even pets. They could be excused for having found refuge at Memorial because since its founding in the 1920s, it was always the safest place to ride out a hurricane. And it was also probably one of the most secure places in an increasingly embattled city. But as the floodwaters rose and the doctors and nurses who had dutifully volunteered to serve out the storm and take care of an increasingly distressed patient body, the thick rope of duty that binds doctors to the people who they care for started to fray. This book is very much, I know I can see your faces, it sounds very serious and a little bit worrying. It's also a book teeming with life. This is a book that takes place in New Orleans, and the people in this book have the very memorable names and personalities of New Orleanians. The doctors' names: John Kokomore, Anna Poe, Horace Baltz, their nurses: Lori Boudreaux, Sheri Landry, Susan Mulderick, and the patients whose stories and whose struggles to stay alive really are the heart of this book. They also have wonderful names: Emmett Everett, Carrie Madeir Hall, that's my favorite, Merle Lagasse. So just as we're plunged into the darkness of a stricken hospital robbed of electricity, with patients inside of it dreaming of a place on the roof on one of the helicopters that is slowly evacuating the people inside of it, we see how a group of doctors and nurses decide that one class of patients, most of them, but not all of them elderly, are going to be the last to leave this hospital. And then we see how that decision begets another decision, which is those people are going to be given an injection, a fatal injection of medicine. The family members of these individuals are desperate for information about their loved ones. They don't know for many, many days after the storm has come and gone what has happened to them. And they're subjected to the most confounding corporate double talk when trying to inquire about the last hours and days of their loved ones' lives. This is a book in which the death of the people in its pages is registered profoundly. In its second half, Sheri Fink draws us into the investigation of what happened at Memorial Hospital. We meet another cast of New Orleans characters, a prosecutor-investigator team named Butch Schaefer and Virginia Ryder, and we see how they devote their lives, every hour, it seems, of their working days, to the truth of what happened during the 5 days of the book's title. This is a truth that is as hard-earned as it is elusive. The people responsible for the deaths in this book do not want their actions to be found. The desperate decisions they made in those last hours, they hope might be excused, like so much of what happened in New Orleans after Katrina. I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but I will say now, I want you guys to know that what you learn in its second half makes you think completely differently about what happened in the first. Like the finest works of literature, 5 days is about the very basic foundation of society, the individual and her choices. It offers the reader a remarkable opportunity to witness medicine, that most essential human interaction, as a proving ground of so many of the problems that we live amongst, cannot find answers for, and fundamentally don't understand. Extreme weather, failing infrastructure, a problematic medical system, and most of all, the vast ethical and moral uncertainty around end of life. Crown is going to publish 5 days on September 10th, and I hope you get a copy of the ARC when you walk out. Thank you.
"5 Days at Memorial" is the story of a hospital. Knocking on Heaven's Door, The Path to a Better Way of Death, written by Katy Butler, is an up-close and personal look at one person's experience with the medical world. Butler helps her mother usher her father through a 6-year nightmare during which death is blocked at every turn, while stroke after stroke abets his spiraling descent into dementia. Published by Simon & Schuster and edited by Whitney Frick, Knocking on Heaven's Door knocked the socks off the entire selection committee of independent booksellers who included it in our slate of 12 fall debut favorites. 2 things make this blistering book stand out. The first is a dead honest personal story, and the second is the implacable insistence on life at any cost that drives the medical establishment into creating the worst and most costly kind of death possible. A third thing I find astonishing is, again, the youth of an obviously prescient editor who, relatively new to the industry, recognized not just the brilliance, but the timeliness of a book that's already taking the bookselling world by storm 4 months before publication. Whitney Frick began her career at Scribner in 2006 after graduating from Northwestern University. She was the first to win the Larry Ashmead Award, an annual prize granted to one young editor in the field of book publishing. She's worked with critically lauded and best-selling authors such as David Finch, Joe Blair, Farley O'Connor, Richard Murray, and Whitney Otto. Her recent and forthcoming publications include Mumbai, New York, Scranton by Tamara Shopson, The Hormone Cure by Sarah Gottfried, MD, Carry On Warrior by Glennon Doyle Melton, and as we all now know, Knocking on Heaven's Door by Katy Butler. Please welcome Simon & Schuster editor, Whitney Frick.
Thank you, Betsy, and I want to echo everyone's thanks. It's such an honor to be up here, and a particular honor because Katy Butler is in the audience. I also wanted to thank all of you. I've sat in this audience many times, and I look forward to this event every year, so it's really thrilling to be at this side of the table. As Betsy said, I'm here today to talk about Knocking on Heaven's Door, the path to a better way of death. Many of you probably hear the word death and think, ugh, that sounds depressing, not for me. But I hope that by the time I'm finished speaking today, you'll see why I'm so deeply passionate about this book and why it absolutely deserves to have been deemed buzzworthy and why it's not at all depressing. I first encountered Katy Butler when I read her New York Times Magazine piece, What Broke My Father's Heart, in June 2010. That piece chronicled the Butler family journey through the medical system after a pacemaker caused her father's heart to outlive his brain. Everyone who reads that piece falls instantly in love with Katy's voice and the brilliant way she weaves together reporting, science, and a sense of spirituality. The article went on to become one of the Times' most emailed articles of 2010, and it garnered thousands of responses from readers. Katy received emails from hundreds of people, including people like Isabel Allende, Philip Gurevich, and Anna Quinlan. So after I read the article, I did what every young editor does when she reads something she loves. I Googled. So soon I had discovered that Katy was an award-winning science writer whose work had been included in the Best American Science Writing, Best Buddhist Writing, and The New Yorker. She was also the winner of a Science and Society Award, and she had been nominated for a National Magazine Award. I also learned that her agent was the esteemed and intimidating Binky Urban, and this was a big indication to me that she was a true pro. So you can imagine how elated I was when, a few months after the Times piece ran, Binky emailed my boss the proposal for Katy Butler's book. Immediately when the proposal came into Scribner, I ran down the hall and begged Nan Graham, please, please, we have to buy this book and you have to let me edit it. And because everyone on the Scribner team felt as enthusiastic about Knocking on Heaven's Door and as excited about Katy's talent as I did, that's pretty much what happened. But it wasn't until about a year later that I really came to see firsthand just how important Katy's story is. In the late fall of 2011, my 93-year-old grandmother fell while she was getting out of the shower and she cut her leg. Up until then, she had been healthy, independent, and active. But with that one small slip in the bathroom, everything changed. She landed in the hospital where she got an infection, which should have been a short stay for some stitches stretched into weeks and weeks and weeks. And over the next several months, my parents put their lives and their jobs on the back burners, started racking up frequent flyer miles, and tried to manage my grandmother's care from afar, flying back and forth from Colorado, where I grew up, to Boston, where my grandmother lived. My whole family and I watched helplessly as my feisty, elegant, wickedly intelligent grandmother grew frustrated and depleted and sick and scared. So while all of this was going on, Katy delivered the first draft of Knocking on Heaven's Door. And I read that book, and it dawned on me. This book was a gift. Katy was giving me and my family the language and the courage we needed to have a conversation with my grandmother about what she wanted for the last phase of her life. Knocking on Heaven's Door is this beautiful braid of memoir and investigative reporting and a spiritual quest into the sacred art of dying. Katy describes what happened to her parents after her aging and ailing father was urged by doctors to have a pacemaker put in to correct a minor and non-life-threatening heart arrhythmia. Although the pacemaker could do nothing over the next 7 years to prevent Katy's father's slide into dementia, immobility, near muteness, and misery, nor could the pacemaker help Katy's mother with the agonizing demands of full-time caregiving. At one point, Katy's father asked for an ending, saying to her mother, "I am living too long." So with that, Katy and her mother appealed to doctors for help. They wanted to get the pacemaker turned off, just to allow her father the peaceful, natural death he had always wanted. But when doctors refused, Katy set out on a quest. She was trying to figure out, how did her family, how did our society come to this place? So she turned to her finely honed skills as a journalist and began asking questions. Why had her father's doctors been so insistent that the pacemaker be put in? How had that advice been influenced by lobbyists, government policy, insurance companies, Medicare, and the medical device manufacturers? What happens when our culture's fear of death collides with modern medicine's single-minded pursuit of longevity? Katy had barely begun to answer these questions when her father died, and he did so uncomfortably, sick, and without the ability to say goodbye. Months later, Katy's mother faced her own life-threatening illness, but this time she refused the invasive Hail Mary treatments recommended by her doctors and confronted death the old-fashioned way, head on. So a couple of years ago, I sat where you're sitting now, and I listened as my boss, Nan, described Siddhartha Mukherjee's The Emperor of All Maladies. Until that day, I would have told you there is absolutely nothing that would make me read a history of cancer. And many of you are probably thinking there's nothing that makes you want to read the story of one family's journey through the end of life. But what Siddhartha Mukherjee did in The Emperor of All Maladies, Katy Butler has done in Knocking on Heaven's Door. Knocking on Heaven's Door belongs on the shelf alongside Mukherjee's book, alongside Andrew Solomon's Far from the Tree, and alongside Ann Fadiman's The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. For each of these expertly reported works of narrative nonfiction, it's the gorgeousness of the writing, the humane and vivid and intimate voices of the authors that pull you in and transcends the book's difficult subject matter. And truly, Katy's voice is seared into my brain. This book has so many exquisite sentences, but to just give you an example, when Katy writes about her relationship with her mother at this time, she writes, "Trying to help my mother was like reaching through a barbed wire fence to water a rose." This book has sentences that are so vivid and image-filled, it makes you gasp. She's also fearless. Katy refuses to shy away from difficult topics. I'm talking about death itself, but I'm also talking about her family's moments of ugliness, the small, everyday arguments and second-guessing that cause all of us to sabotage our own best intentions. Knocking on Heaven's Door is one family's story, but it's one that's going to look familiar to so many of us. The early endorsements that have come in for this from people like Mary Pfeiffer, Alexandra Styron, Adam Hochschild, Sherwin Newland, and Anne Lamott, and many others, they only testify to Katy's strength as a writer and also to audiences' appetite for this book's message. Knocking on Heaven's Door is, as Betsy said, extremely timely. There are 24 million baby boomers caring for aging parents in America right now. And I bet many of you can think of a friend currently trying to take care of an aging loved one, or perhaps some of you are caring for dying parents yourselves. 75% of the elderly say they want to die at home, but 44% die in hospitals, nearly a fifth of them in intensive care units. And the number of people over the age of 85 is supposed to triple by 2050. So as our population ages and the cost of healthcare continues to soar, conversations about end-of-life care become imperative. Knocking on Heaven's Door is a map through the labyrinth of modern medicine. And the way Katy juxtaposes her parents' two deaths, her father's, which was prolonged, painful, wildly expensive, and suffered in silence, versus her mother's, which was quick, graceful, brave, and confronted openly, that's what gives this book its message of hope and its power of redemption. Katy advocates for slow medicine, which is a practice that promotes care over cure. Slow medicine is the antidote we all need to the hurried, expensive choices we often make in moments of panic and fear. For my family, knocking on heaven's door was the key we needed to unlock a conversation with my grandmother about what she wanted in the last phase of her life. When my grandmother told us she had had enough of the sterile hospital room and the roving cast of doctors, nurses, and roommates, we listened. Sentences from Knocking on Heaven's Door echoed in my mind as we brought my grandmother home, expressed our love and concern, and we let her go, peacefully, comfortable, and on her own terms, without the soundtrack of beeping machines behind us. So now I hope you understand why Knocking on Heaven's Door isn't at all dark or bleak or depressing. It's visionary and groundbreaking. It's going to inspire conversations in this country and spark a cultural change toward a better way of death for all of us. It is not about the ending, it's about beginning. It's not about death, but about life.
And now, to talk about the other end of the spectrum, and on a lighter, if no less important note, because what, after all, is more important than parenting, Jennifer Senior's All Joy and No Fun, The Paradox of Modern Parenthood, edited by Ecco's editorial director, Lee Boudreaux, investigates the actual document effects on parents of those pesky invaders into our lives and hearts. Children, sleepless nights, fractured focus, lack of sex, to name a few. And that's just during the first few years. As Senior takes us through the developmental years, as she clearly documents the agonies of parenting through extensive and thought-provoking interviews with both parents and experts, bringing into sharp focus the not-so-easy reality of parenthood. Not a parenting book per se. All Joy and No Fun is the parenting book everyone considering parenthood ought to buy. There might be fewer children in the world, but their experience of parenting would be vastly improved. Here to say more is Lee Boudreaux, who became the editorial director of Ecco, an imprint of HaperCollins in 2005 after 9 years at Random House. Her books include Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk by Ben Fountain, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a National Book Award finalist last year. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which won the 2012 Orange Prize for Fiction. The Story of Edgar's Hotel by David Wroblewski, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller, was an Indie Next List #1 book, and an Oprah Book Club selection. Lucette Lognato's award-winning memoir, The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit, and Jennifer Senior's brilliantly researched and provocative forthcoming All Joy and No Fun, The Paradox of Modern Parenting. Please welcome Lee Boudreaux.
Thank you very much. I have to say I'm truly humbled to be on a panel with these wonderful, wonderful books. You didn't think that All Joy, No Fun was going to be the comic relief of this panel, did you? But it turns out. This is a book I feel passionately about. It came from this magazine cover article 3 summers ago entitled, I Love My Children, I Hate My Life, The Misery of the American Parent. I was of 2 minds when I saw this. I had a 2-year-old at home at the time, so I knew this expression well. I was very familiar with it. It means you've spent 18 solid hours careening from exhaustion to anger, through incompetence many times, back to exhaustion again, and over to complete frustration. But I also realized it was a New York-centric piece. It was meant to be extremely provocative, and I thought perhaps it would be about a certain kind of parenting in a certain kind of place with a certain kind of expectation, and I may not find my own experience mirrored as precisely as, in fact, I did. We read the article there at Ecco. We were blown away by Jennifer's rigorous research of the material, her vigorous writing of it, her intelligence, and her warmth. And we met with her, and we saw a clip of her doing a TV show, and I realized I wanted to be a part of whatever this woman was going to write. She could pivot from any topic. She ping-ponged the questions that we were throwing at her, from the father of a teenage daughter to somebody who did not yet have children and was debating it, to me with my 2-year-old who was sort of seeking very practical advice when I was supposed to be determining what the book outline was going to be. We ended up universally thinking we're going to turn her loose to embrace this material and wrestle it, and we will see what she comes up with at the end. Because if you thought my sales force was going to let me get away with 400 pages on the misery of the American parent, no, indeed. They thought perhaps it needed a slightly different focus. And after 3 years of wrestling with the material, Jennifer has produced an absolutely wonderful, incredibly readable book, so beautifully written and magnificently researched. I will read you a quote we just got from Daniel Gilbert in a moment that sort of attests to that. But in short, I would say this is not a parenting book. A parenting book is what parents read to determine what effect they should have on those children. If you want them to sleep differently or eat differently or study differently or somehow succeed in life, that is the way the telescope usually is focused in a parenting book. This is a parenthood book. It is describing to us the topography of our lives, what it feels like to be a parent. If what to expect when you're expecting is about the pregnancy phase, this book is meant to say what you can expect when that child is 3 or 9 or 14, which are very, very, very different animals. Or to put it another way, if Judith Warner told us what it was like to live in the age of madness, Jennifer Sr. has gone about trying to figure out how we got to be in this age of madness and why it is so difficult to escape. And what she has ended up doing, and you will get a galley on the way out, and you will see this laid out as lucidly as possible as early as the introduction. She has come up with an idea of the 3 things that have changed the most in the last 75 years of parenting. How the social changes, the economic changes, the educational, the advances in medicine, how so many different forces have come together to truly change what parenting is like in this day and age, and why to some of us, especially if we've had children later in life, why it feels like we are doing something that does not quite have a template before it, despite the fact that this has been going on for quite some time now. And Jennifer does indeed talk about the universals, but she takes these 3 strands of what is different, and then she organizes the book chronologically, because again, a newborn is very different than a teenager. So she kind of takes you through while always circling around what has changed and what has not. And the social science embedded here, because again, this article came from the fact that psychologists, economists, behavioral economists, all different disciplines were coming up with studies, even when they were trying to study something else, that pointed out that parents were far more unhappy than their childless peers and subjected to a greater amount of stress. No surprise to the parents in the audience. But she wanted to know why these findings seem to be so universal, and yet they go against the very grain of what we believe, the meaningfulness of this experience, and how most of us would look back on it in retrospect and say it was indeed perhaps the most important thing we did. How do these things coexist? So she starts out with newborns. And these chapters are sort of elegantly, seamlessly written, but I will just give you one little diamond chip from each one. When she's talking about newborns, for example, she talks about, and again, with the research, the psychologists, the people who are the experts in these studies and in these fields, she talks about that state of flow, which we are now used to hearing about from athletes and people, I'm in the zone, I'm in the flow. So it's not the simplistic explanation of, well, children interrupt you a lot, don't they? What she's talking about here is the fact that there is a very specific feedback loop of getting yourself into the zone. And here are the reasons that taking care of young children in particular make that impossible, even when you think you've carved out time to yourself. And also, in that feedback loop, very specific positive things have to happen too, which newborns or very young children are impossible of giving back to you. So that is why it feels the way it does, that it is constantly fractured. It's not just that they're waking up all the time. There are a lot of things going around. You will recognize yourself on every page of this book, and yet she never quite speaks to you through that obvious way of like, of course I knew that was the problem all along. She's constantly coming at it from a different angle and giving you sort of the studies and the tools and the vocabulary to understand it better, even though you're well acquainted with the phenomenon she's describing. In the chapter on marriage, she speaks quite a bit about the division of labor, even though it's very different than it ever was a generation ago. But in this chapter, the gem of it is how disruptive normlessness is, that every family kind of figures it out on their own, that we've only been doing this for a generation or 2 generations, that women were completely in the workforce, that the home life was different, that husbands and fathers were expected to do so much more, and indeed they are. But many of the studies here show, for example, that the wife's perception of how much that husband is doing has a much greater effect on how happy she is than the actual number. The numbers are not far off. She says he's doing 35%. He says he's doing 45%. The real answer turns out to be 40. But the perception of who's getting the shaft from the other one is enormous. This chapter should actually come with a warning. Do not read this in bed at night when you're trying to go to sleep. I have punched my husband awake so many times to read out a certain statistic, to be like, you know that fight we just had? Here is why we had it. I've perhaps suggested that in order to stay married, he should read this chapter. It really is. It is one of the most eye-opening things. And again, I'm recognizing things constantly, but had never been able to put my finger on why. I'm skipping chapter 3 for a moment because it's one of my favorite. Chapter 4, concerted cultivation. Those middle school years, why has it gotten so competitive? Why is super parenting the norm? As one of the parents who I was talking to before this panel who was familiar with the material said, who took the fun out of it? But most people who are parenting children in that age are involved in a sort of hyper-scheduling and hyper-performance, that they would like to go back to that wonderful era of benign neglect, but too many things have changed. So sort of the cri de coeur of like, when your mother tells you, I did it this way, it's a little harder to kind of pull off now. She goes on to a chapter on teenagers. I'm 10 years away from having a teenager. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. There's a section on the changes in technology and the way this affects the dynamics of a family. For example, in order to keep an eye on what your 14-year-old is doing, you need to be their Facebook friend. They have to friend you. You can't just walk through a room and find out what they're watching on TV, and TV shows don't just end after a half an hour. They're on a computer. You have to lean over their shoulder. You have to watch what they're doing. It doesn't end. You have to put a time boundary on something that used to have sort of a natural clock. And the other thing is, the generation of technology happens so fast, your 14-year-old often ends up knowing more about that machine than you do. So you are telling her, you're not allowed to do that. Now, show me how to turn it off. This is somewhat disruptive and also somewhat new. So that is how she goes about organizing this really terrific amount of material. And I will tick off for you quickly my favorite things about this book. The breadth of the research. She will, over here, grab Matthew Crawford's Shop Class's Soul Craft, one of Venessa Mobley's wonderful books, and it's one of my favorite parts of what Jennifer does, because she's talking about the joys of small children, and she brings so much of his research to bear on what is so cognitively satisfying about making something with your hands, even if it's only a gingerbread house, especially if you work in an information job. Daddy, what do? I watch numbers go by on a screen. Doing something with your hands has a very, has far-reaching effects, which Mr. Crawford beautifully delineated and which Jennifer is now combining with other material to sort of illustrate why it is so sublimely pleasing at times to re-enter this world of childhood. Also, the joys of philosophy. Why is water wet? And to sort of grapple with those again in a way that you probably haven't for years. Over here, she'll pick up Margaret Mead in 1942, talking about how American parents uniquely dispose of all the folkways and try to reinvent every generation on their own. She'll do a study of parents in the 1950s, so the golden age of Donna Reed, and there's a mother who says, well, we knew where babies came from, but I did not know it was going to be this much work. And then the fathers kind of chip in like what she said, except no sex. And this is from the much vaunted era when everybody, looking at that in in retrospect, it felt like they were all doing it right, and we're just the confused generation. And then she'll grab the Nobel-winning behavioral economist over here. She'll throw in a little Louis C.K. She's got the beautiful Andrew Solomon. She has done the work that you don't have to. You just get to read this book. But she really does synthesize and combine, and she has the best-selling books you've heard of. She has the social science studies that you would never have come in contact with. It's from some ethnography study, but she has gathered these all together and written about it beautifully in a way, again, you will recognize. Her emotional intelligence is sublime. I do not read academic books. I didn't even when I was in college. If this didn't really read like a novel, so that the characters, the mother doing this and the separated parents doing this and the teenager over here going through this problem, if they didn't come alive on the page, I'm certain this would not have been a book that I would have felt so passionately about acquiring. The geographical reach, this is most certainly not a book for a certain thin level of the upper middle class with very particular worries about how to get into 3 very particular colleges. She goes over here to Minneapolis, she goes down here to Houston, she is finding American neighborhoods that are as representative of the country as a whole. I think there is one kid in this book who goes to private school, everybody else is in public school, everybody else is grappling with the real life middle class conundrums and how to raise children in this world. And my very favorite thing about this book is the 2 chapters she spends on joy. And if that sounds like the balance is off, that there are 4 chapters on how miserable it is and 2 chapters on joy, as she says, the vocabulary for irritation is actually quite large. To speak of what is transcendent and joyous is actually very hard to put your finger on. And she does an absolutely magnificent job in these 2 chapters, and she ends up sending you away with the feeling, I'm saying what everybody else is saying, my book is not depressing. But she does. She ends up kind of sending you away on a raft of realizing not only that there is an end to each of these stages, not only that there are many ways philosophically and through sort of hard science to understand why your day feels like it does. She also lets you know you are not alone, and she does really these poetically beautiful jobs of sort of painting in the picture of what the great joys are and why this is such a meaningful endeavor, and why we remember it so differently than we experience it, but how important that is at the end of the day. So again, I do hope you'll pick up a galley on your way out. Thank you so much for coming to the Buzz panel, and enjoy.
I just want to say thank you one more time to these wonderful women, these editors, and their books. Thank you.